Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, everyone. I think most people are on mute. I've set things up so that it mutes you on entry, but everyone can unmute themselves when they want to participate. All right, good morning, everyone. We'll probably pick up a few more as we go, but I'm guessing this is a quorum. So welcome to the session A on socioeconomic systems. I'm Tom Fitteman with Ventana Systems, and I think my colleague Ron Suter is on with us as well, and maybe also Laura Peterson. So the plan for today, if you haven't been on one of the previous calls, is a quick round of introductions, and then I'll say a little bit in terms of an overview of what we're trying to achieve here. But then most of this is meant to be a discussion of the opportunities for integrating socioeconomic systems with other aspects of oil spill dynamics, with ecosystems and physics and health and so forth. And also just to think about what are the integration needs even within the socioeconomic systems box. And we will use as a starting point some diagrams that we've been building up from the last couple of conversations on ecosystems and health, but there's always a lot more to think about and to add to the system. So this is meant to be kind of a creative and brainstorming process that taps your knowledge, not us talking at you. So I'd love to do a quick round of introductions. Let's see, I think probably the easy way is if I just unmute everyone for a moment, and then I'll do kind of a roll call so we capture everybody. And I'll start with myself. I'm Tom Fitteman. I'm with Ventana Systems. We're a consulting and software company that does dynamic modeling. We're kind of generalists. I've done everything from the dairy commodity supply chain and federal regulation process to aircraft logistics to climate change. And it's really the climate and energy systems that are my primary interest. I spend most of my time actually building dynamic models that are largely in the energy economy space, but with a strong physical science component as well. Okay, so let's do a quick run around the table. Let's see, the top of the list is Chuck Wilson. Maybe if you could just say where you are and a one-liner about your interest in integration. I'll just move on to Dennis Wiesenberg.
It's Dennis Wiesenberg. I'm professor of marine science at the University of Southern Mississippi. I'm a member of the Gulf Research Board and one of the people interested in making sure these workshops all link together.
Great. Helena, I don't know if you're on verbal or not.
Yes.
Oh, your audio is breaking up a bit. Perhaps you need no introduction. Let's move on to Katya.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Katya Woke, Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies out of Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and I've been helping with Helena and others to lead the Socioeconomic group and webinar.
Great. Barbara Wiseman.
Hi, Barbara Wiseman. I'm the international president of the Lawrence Anthony Earth Organization. We were involved, very focused during the BP spill on finding a solution that would effectively clean up the water without creating other side effects. And we came across and researched many different technologies and worked with BP and the government to try to get the ones implemented that we felt were most effective.
Great. Let's see. It looks like the list is dynamically rearranging itself on me. So apologies if I miss you. Krista.
Hello, I'm Krista Court. I'm with the Food and Resource Economics Department at the University of Florida, and I am a regional economic modeler, regional economist. Most of our work regarding the oil spill has been estimating economic impact of recreational visits as well as commercial and recreational fishing.
Great. Igal Berstein.
Hi, I'm Igal. I'm a postdoc at the Rosenstiel School for Marine and Atmospheric Sciences, University of Miami. I work with Professor Claire Paris, and I gave a webinar on last Monday about frameworks, quantitative frameworks that we created, looking, among other things, on socioeconomics.
And incidentally, you can find the webinar on the GoMRI page, and you can catch it on YouTube if you missed it the first time around. Worth a look. Michael Jepson.
Yeah, I just, sorry, I had some computer issues and just got logged on. So I guess, are you doing introductions?
We're just doing a quick introduction where you are and what your interest is in integration of socioeconomic systems with all things oil spill.
Okay, so I'm an anthropologist at the NOAA Fisheries Southeast Regional Office, and basically my job is to do social impact assessments for fishery management plans, but I've been involved in a project where we created a suite of social vulnerability indices for coastal communities around the nation. And I've also been on the Gulf of Mexico IEA steering committee and have been working with them on a few projects to integrate human dimension, integrated ecosystem assessment model.
Great. Let's see. We have Missy.
Hi, yeah, I'm Misty Partique with Mississippi, Alabama Sea Grant. I'm a part of the oil spill outreach team. My focus area on the outreach team is areas of human health and social dimensions. And so Chris Hale from our team was one on the webinar on Monday, but she was unable to attend the workshop today. So I'm covering for the team.
Thanks. Somebody in area code 251. Let's see if that doesn't ring a bell. 3-1. Oh, go ahead.
that might be me. This is Kevin Shaw, the program manager for GoMRI, and I'm just listening in for just for informative purposes, and also just kind of checking on the logistics of these approaches, webinar approaches.
Thanks. Who'd I miss? Michael Feldman.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Feldman, and myself, along with Chuck Wilson, I've been trying to coordinate and organize the entire GoMRI Synthesis and Legacy effort, of which this is a part of. So I'll just be a active listener today. Thank you.
Great. And who'd I miss? TK Collier. On mute, it looks like. You can unmute yourself at any time. Let's see, anybody else that I missed?
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Rex Caffey, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Center for Socio-Economics. Thanks.
Okay. So let's roll on. Just a quick reminder: we're recording this session, but not for public distribution, just for internal use. Including people on the invite list who may be unable to attend today, but not for wider distribution. We don't expect this to be a polished product or anything. Okay, so let me say a little bit about framing, and then I want to show you some diagrams that we're building up and other kinds of lists and artifacts that we're compiling as a way to get our arms around this complicated space, and we'll go from there. So our charter is to help the synthesis efforts by coming up with conceptual designs for integrated models or portfolios of models or sort of other ways of making connections among models that can help answer stakeholder questions in kind of the integrated space of oil spills. This is the conceptual framework that we're starting with and is working pretty well as kind of an organizing principle here, essentially breaking things up into physics, ecosystems, human health, and socioeconomic systems. But of course, I think as Krista quoted John Muir, when you pull on one thing, you find it's connected to everything else. So decision making and tight connections among these processes mean that the boundaries are fuzzy among the boxes. So part of integration as we're thinking about it means not just getting the components of the model working together, but also getting the components of the model connected to stakeholder questions and decisions that need to be made so that the models ultimately have influence. So even if a component is a piece of you know, very detailed science in a domain that has no direct policy implications per se, we want the insights that come out of that to inform models and ultimately inform decision makers through the tools and information that's available to them. So part of the task is to further improve the connectivity of this network and bring the islands into the whole and things like that. Socioeconomic systems is, in a sense, both central to everything, but hasn't been as central to the research so far, it appears. So if you look at the publications page, for example, there isn't actually a category for socioeconomic systems, but then when you start reading through the papers, socioeconomic impacts and feedbacks are implicit in lots of things, like the second paper here. It's really kind of the central theme. So as we think about this, we always start off a modeling process thinking about some design questions around what's the use case for the model, who's going to make what decision on the basis of the content of the model, how might they change their decision or their behavior, what are the questions that they want to ask, and on what time horizon and with what detail. And then there's also questions of logistics, of how do you actually get the model out there to users? How do you feed it data? How often do you update it? And who runs it, maintains it, interprets the results, puts them out for the world? And that can take a wide variety of forms, from the traditional report to an online tool. And really a big part of that is, how does the modeling community act like an organism rather than a bunch of isolated islands, and actually grow and learn together? There are lots of different possible ways of doing this technically, and we're trying to kind of think about all of these at once. So essentially what we're starting with is a portfolio of models that tackle independent subsets of the problem, but probably a lot could be done to simply exploit that portfolio better by making connections among the content of those and kind of creating a roadmap for users that when they come to this problem space, guides them to a model that answers the questions they have. And then kind of the next step is to federate those components, either through data flow or interfaces, so that you can literally connect the results of one model to another. And of course, that immediately brings on all sorts of challenges of getting the time granularity and detail and scale of the models to match one another. Kind of the logical endpoint, or maybe sometimes the illogical endpoint of that, is to create a single, completely integrated model that contains all aspects of several models across multiple domains. That gives you kind of the most information, but it also takes the biggest budget and the biggest runtime, and involves other trade-offs, like making it more difficult to propagate uncertainty. So then yet another possible approach is more of a meta-modeling approach where you, instead of literally federating or integrating a bunch of big models, you create meta-models of the components and integrate those with response surfaces or other simple dynamic model representations of what's going on in detail, and you build a kind of a top-down 50,000-foot view of the system that's very fast and flexible, but requires you to squint a little bit because a lot of the detail has been abstracted away. And of course, all of these things, there's reality is so much bigger than any of our models. There's a lot of art to this that's somewhat difficult to write down. So these are just more things to think about as we talk through what we have available to us now and how we might put those pieces together to get a more integrated, holistic decision support system. Any comments before I continue? Okay. I'll just highlight a couple of things from Monday's webinar that I thought were of particular relevance here. One was David's points about choosing a decision-making relevant scale. I thought that was a useful construct, that we're thinking about spatial and temporal scales, which you're kind of immediately led to when you're building a model because you have to, you know, choose a spatial grid and a time step if you're doing any dynamics, but also there are other scales of interest related to the kind of the organizational context in which the model resides, scales of networks and the institutions that you're either trying to influence or trying to serve with the model. Good things to keep in mind. He also mentioned that having sort of a process in place or links in place to facilitate thinking about the needs of your collaborators and your sort of decision-making clients on an ongoing basis is a key part of the learning process and maintaining the relevance of the model. I don't know, I think David's not on the call. One thing he didn't mention in the webinar that I thought was notable was the Gulf of Mexico Ecosystems Viewer, which I think he's involved in. I don't know if anybody on the call wants to say anything about it, but I thought this was a useful example of a tool that takes some of the system all the way to decision makers in a way that's pretty interactive. So this is an online site that lets you browse through multiple aspects of ecosystem service valuation. Igal's talk summarized some work with the connectivity modeling system and downstream models getting to social vulnerability and fishery system impacts. A nice example of integration of the socioeconomic systems with the physics and ecosystem boxes. And I thought there was a useful point on one of his slides about the very extensive outputs from the physics and ecosystem models are probably only beginning to be exploited on the human health and socioeconomic side. So there's a lot of data about the distribution of toxins and other sorts of impacts on ecosystems and so forth. And those ripple into the socioeconomic system in via some fairly direct paths that have already been tested, but also there are lots of indirect impacts that are not yet connected into these. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in a few minutes. And then finally, actually, Krista mentioned a bunch of those knock-on effects. So for example, when you close fisheries, you not only have a short-term impact on fishing revenue because the harvest is curtailed in various areas, but you might also have long-term effects from loss of market share or brand equity or shifting consumer preferences, permanent changes in tastes and habits and so forth. Lots of potential knock-on effects that essentially when you alter the physical system or the physical biological system, you then create path-dependent changes within the socioeconomic system based on those impacts. You don't need to absorb the detail of this, although I've sent the link out before, I think, if you want to play with it. This is a visualization of Sea Grant's compilation of questions around questions from stakeholders. And the orange dots on this diagram are socioeconomic system questions. They're in the socio box. And the interesting thing about this is the connectivity here. The blue dots are the physics box, and actually if you were in the full diagram off to the left, there'd be a lot more blue dots about oil dispersal and fate and degradation and sediments and things like that. But basically there are relatively few direct connections among the questions anyway from the physical system to the socioeconomic system, but there are a bunch of connections that are mediated either by ecosystems or by health. So ecosystems are yellow and health is green. So one pathway is oil and toxin exposure through health influences community health and impacts on vulnerable populations and things like that. And then the other pathway mediated through impacts on fisheries and shellfish and things like that, affecting not only health, but also economic impacts on coastal communities. So that's the connectivity of the stakeholder questions. An interesting question then is to what extent sort of the same structure is emergent in the connectivity of sort of the actual physics of the system as you start building a model of this. So I want to talk a little bit about what's specifically in the socioeconomic box, and then what are the connections to ecosystems, physics, and human health, and how that all maps to the decision-making processes that are in the green box here. And this will be, I think, necessarily sort of a free-ranging process, so please jump in at any time with questions, comments, thoughts. So this initial list, and actually we'll come at this multiple ways, so we may add items to this a little bit later. But I'm primarily interested in this middle column of what do we consider to be in the socioeconomic systems box. I listed a couple of items that we've heard so far. So population, and of course, you could sort of add dimensions of detail to each of these things. So population means also potentially demographics, age disaggregation, and income categories and things like that. Same thing for capital. So capital is infrastructure, fishing industry capacity, capital in other kinds of, hotels, things like that. Employment, again, you could add sector detail to that. Community health, social networks. Are there other key things that are kind of measure the state of health of a coastal socioeconomic system? One thing that's in a lot of the questions is resilience. And resilience is kind of a broad concept. Could we describe the resilience of a community by these 5 states, or is there more to it than that? Is anybody working in that space?
Hi, sorry, I had myself on mute. So this is Missy from Sea Grant. And I see, that you've got the ecosystem state and the ecosystem impacts as being their own separate kind of area, at least if I'm reading how you have the figure listed here. But for a number of coastal communities, those ecosystem impacts are part and parcel of human welfare and economic activity and community resilience. For instance, oyster beds. Oyster beds that are heavily impacted, following an oil spill means that there's less availability of those oyster populations for the community to get economic benefit from, but it can also mean long-term impacts to that coastal area if those oyster beds then die and aren't reseeded or repopulated, restored in some way, then that coastal zone can become more vulnerable to future impacts. And so I would say that those are all kind of wrapped up, that you have to have a healthy environment in a lot of these coastal systems in order to have a healthy community.
Yeah, so in a sense, the ecosystem state is tightly coupled to the community or the socioeconomic system by reliance on that ecosystem to provide various kinds of sort of provisioning of services or other things.
Like straight up economics, 100%, but I can tell you, working in some of the smaller communities on the coast, the failure of some of these resources to return after a spill and then maybe subsequent other types of disasters like hurricanes weighs on them mentally as well. Mm-hmm. And I was on the call last week. We were talking about the coupled ecosystems as well, and you did a great job of your diagrams that you showed all those cross interrelated aspects. And so I think that those still are important to point out here in terms of economic activity or human welfare, how the environment plays in.
Sure, and actually you just mentioned a couple of other inputs. So one is weather and climate. Well, actually, so weather, climate, and presumably there are other impacts. We've got population as an internal state, but part of the reason the population is there is from migration from other places. So there are also connections to sort of inland conditions in various senses, where the relative attractiveness of the coast versus the interior is driving people to migrate.
Do politics come in? Are they considered in here at all?
Oh, that's actually a great point. And maybe not just politics, but also institutions and governance in other senses, things that are kind of the social infrastructure. Modeling that, while there's certainly lots of interesting models of politics, it's often difficult to integrate those. But you could imagine that would come in if you're trying to look at, say the median voters' appreciation for policies that you're trying to implement in your model. And of course, the model could become politicized if it really becomes influential in a policy debate. Other additions?
We were also hearing, along those lines, though, that just at a conference that a number of the folks on the line here were at in New Orleans this week, talking about some of these issues, and sometimes some of the decision making or human welfare or economic activities are tightly coupled with political decision making, or like you said, decision making inside institutions, and that sometimes people's perception too of climate and weather or ecosystem state can fall pretty closely along party lines.
Yeah. And if I could spell institutions, that might help. Right, so in a sense, you have the sort of the filter bubble or polarization problem of people viewing the problem and the data and the structure of the system through a lens that may be shaped by predispositions that don't have much to do with actually going out and measuring what's happening on the seafloor or something.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah. Right. Unfortunately, but inevitably.
Well, so this is Katja, and these are really great points. I'd just like to add that there's institutions as an outcome, like having the institution there, but there's also institutions as a process. And so it's not necessarily scripted and falling across party lines when at the local level, the processes are there for deeper engagement and shared learning and shared social learning, really. I think some of that starts to fall away when the processes for engagement are deeper, more robust.
That's a really good point. It's almost polarization is sort of a process that thrives in darkness, and if you have institutional processes that kind of illuminate things and bring information into decision making and get people together in clever ways without their biases at the forefront, then you may get much better outcomes. Is that sort of the flavor of what you were thinking?
Trusted processes, co-production knowledge, these are the sentiments.
Great point.
So this is Krista. I just wanted to use a slightly different word there. I would usually talk about if I'm incorporating limitations from regulations, that would be one way that I build in institutions, but also just talking about the institutional perspective on the issue, that it might, or a political perspective on the issue. It sort of informs how decision making is happening, but it's not necessarily an input or an output to my model's process. process. Like acknowledging that they only see
Just a
parts
second. I'm going to just hit the mute all button to get rid of the feedback here. Okay, sorry about that. Now anybody who wants to speak can unmute themselves again. Let's see, I'm not sure I have a single word to capture that insight in the table here. If you do, feel free to jump in. If not, I'll capture it when I review this later, and we'll talk about it again in the ecosystem and the health session, B session in a couple weeks. Okay, my guess is we'll discover a few things that we forgot about as we move on to talking about the more detailed structure of the system.
Wait, Tom, if I could just...
Oh yeah, sure.
Sorry. I don't know that this can be modeled, so I don't know that you want to even include it here, but the cultural values is a key component of socioeconomic resilience. And I'm not saying it can be modeled, but I wouldn't want to leave it out either.
Right, and even if we're not going to model the change in those values, we probably want to be aware of differences that exist so that we can, you know, have outputs in the model that are reflective of how the outcomes are different depending on how you see them from your culture lens.
Can I just make one point about how to fit my comment into the table?
Yeah, please.
I honestly don't think it fits in the table, but it's more of a, if we think of different perspectives on the issue or the larger issue, then it's like describing which items in the table are visible to those perspectives, because not everybody is considering all of these things when they're making decisions or when they're forming an opinion. So I would describe it as, you know, which of these boxes are visible under the perspective of, you know, a politician versus a scientist versus someone who's just been impacted by the oil spill as an oysterman.
Right. Yeah. So in a way, that's I put it on the same row as cultural values because in some ways it's similar. So if you think of politicians as having a different culture or paradigm from oyster harvesters, then they would be looking at different metrics as indicative of success.
I have another one to add potentially. This is Rex.
Yeah.
Infrastructure, and it may already be up there somehow in capital, but
right.
Yeah.
Yep. And there would probably be some others, capital, you know, supporting tourism and fishing and a few other sectors would be of particular interest. But coastal infrastructure is clearly key. Okay.
Can I comment something?
Please.
I think a lot of these points in the internal states are connected to the social vulnerability indices, which include capital, infrastructure, also family status, and all these are very relevant for that point.
Oh, right. Okay. So that's essentially an indicator that captures a number of the other items that are here.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Let's keep going, but we can come back to this if other thoughts occur. One thing I was wondering about is what models already exist in the space. So in the webinar, somebody mentioned the kind of general purpose input-output type regional economic models, IMPLAN, and things like that. Presumably there are also CGE type models that are potentially more dynamic or a little less reliant on fixed factors. And I don't know if there are any sort of fully behavioral dynamic models that are even richer than that. That's one class of tool that gets employed for local decision making in general. I don't know to what extent these have been connected yet. And then there are also more kind of custom one-off economic impact models for, say, sectoral activity and fisheries or things like that. I guess one such model was deployed in the work with the connectivity modeling system to look at fisheries closure impacts. Is there a name attached to that model?
No, it's a combination of models. So the oil spill and transport was done through the connectivity modeling system, and then there was the use of the vessel monitoring system data, but there's no name. And then revenue reports and social vulnerability indices, but we did not give a name for that sequence.
Right. Okay. And there wasn't some off-the-shelf model that you could use for kind of the downstream economic component of the fisheries stuff. You created your own.
Yeah, it just reported revenues, so it's not really a model. Just
right. It's price times quantity is the extent of the model then.
It sounds like it's just the direct impacts that would go into a broader model.
Right. Yeah, so presumably you could go one step further and take the fisheries sector impact from that and plug it into Implan or whatever that has enough sectoral detail to have like a fishing and forestry sector or something, and then that would give you spillovers to other onshore industries, for example. Are there other things that have been employed in this space? I just happened to bump into a proposal on a NOAA site for a model called Gulfstream, which would be a dynamic spatial economic analysis model. I don't know if anybody's involved in that or aware of that.
So that's mine.
Oh, cool.
And I actually got an email right before joining the phone call that it was not funded. So, and the reason was that they didn't think it was spatial or dynamic. So we were tanked by one reviewer that didn't get it.
Oh no.
But that's okay. We'll keep trying.
Yes, do. I thought, oh great, our job is done.
We'll keep trying.
Are there other things happening in the space?
So this is Mike Jepson, and we started out with the IEA in the Gulf, looking at a couple of different projects, and really started out at the very basic level, and we're using mental to kind of begin to kind of frame out the entire ecosystem, scope of what we were going to do, and then have been working with Mental Modeler to create this conceptual model of what we are trying to do with a couple of projects. And then I think the plan is to move from the Mental Modeler to something like Stella to kind of begin assessing values and the different links and things like that.
Okay. So maybe in some ways similar to this effort. I probably even know the people you're working with. Okay. And is there a particular focus for that? Is it coastal communities or fisheries or any subset, or is it kind of everything?
Well, we're using it in the Mid-Barataria Sediment Diversion Project.
Okay.
So yeah, looking at fisheries, but also communities and trying to, the entire scope of that project.
Right. Great. Probably having a particular project focus makes it a lot easier to decide what's in and what's out.
Definitely.
Anything else?
Yeah, this is Rex. I could just quickly name some categories of things that would probably fit under here.
Sure.
So historically, the integration that I've seen has been bioeconomic models, multi-criteria decision-making models, which are really more indice based. And more recently, I've seen some long-term multi-decadal biomass projection models like EcoPath and EcoSim being used in combination with some more conventional economic REMI models or benefits transfer extrapolations to try and couple physical, biological, or ecological change with economic change.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. And actually, I'm going to move a couple of these to the next slide because I think that they're additions here. So I just started thinking about what kinds of models are in the space, or maybe more loosely than models, sort of models and other techniques. So there seems like there are a bunch of different threads to the literature or modeling disciplines that are involved in this that don't always talk to each other all that much. So on the modeling side, there's the regional economic modeling domain, sort of the REMIs and IMPLANs of the world. Then typically somewhat separate are the spatial dynamic models that are more connected to the GIS world. And then there's cost benefit analysis, which is sort of more of an approach than a particular modeling flavor, or it's an endpoint. And that's coupled to things like accounting and finance, where people are interested in looking at, okay, how much did this really cost for cost BP or cost some other entity. Gets connected to risk analysis as well. And then in yet another kind of stovepipe is ecosystem valuation, which actually here should be connected to cost benefit analysis as well, which employs contingent valuation for willingness to pay for, say, existence values of ecosystem components. And then at that point, you're also merging into actually what should be a much bigger bubble in a sense, which is qualitative social science, looking at both how people value and assess things and how they make decisions, and also how communities are connected to one another, and that feeds into social network analysis as well. So I think, for example, multi-criteria decision making is another class of tool that could be a bubble on this diagram. Are there any other sort of major threads that have been involved in the process or should be involved in the process?
So this is Krista Court again. I have a student that's working now that we're 10 years out and have 10 years of data that we can look at, working on quasi-experimental methods, so that we can look back and infer an actual causal relationship and disentangle effects from the oil spill from others.
And is that looking at impacts on social network structure or things like that, or is there a particular?
She's going to look in her dissertation. She's going to look specifically at impacts on employment levels in different, let's call them ocean economy sectors.
Ah, okay. So, so it's basically sort of data science to extract causality.
Yeah, I think I'd call it data science or econometric methods.
Yeah.
But it's not something that would be available for us right after an oil spill to use.
Right. Except perhaps on the basis of other oil spills.
Right, right.
I have run into quite a few assessments that are kind of multi-spill views of the system. And with sort of within your community, do these bubbles talk to each other very well? Or, for example, at the conference earlier this week, are all of these things represented and interacting? Or is there some value to improving that connectivity?
This is Rex. I will tell you, we always have an element of, I would say, almost every one of these at every one of our meetings. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure can.
The challenge is with limited time and space is getting them, like you said, the linkages between them, getting them interacting. We're making some progress on that, but there's a lot of work to be done. So they're there in silos as far as methodologies and approaches, and we tend to categorize them that way in sessions, but it's a little bit bigger challenge to integrate them. So
sure. Would it help to have more funding or something? Is the limiting resource money or time or geographic proximity?
Money's fine, and we would never say no to money, but really this whole thing is constrained by time, especially in the wake of an event. But even 10 years out, there's a lot of time needed to really think seriously about how to develop at various temporal and spatial scales the decision maker appropriate model that's multidisciplinary, and I shouldn't say singular models. So maybe the thing to do would really be to build on successes, the limited ones that are out there, and identify what those are as part of a longer conference or a longer workshop.
Yeah, I would echo that. This is Krista again. In the conferences I usually attend are regional science conferences, and I would say that these bubbles are all represented there in some form or fashion, and it's becoming more common for them to talk to one another and try to incorporate or integrate the different methods or modeling when they can. But I would say it's certainly funding. I think David mentioned on the webinar that we don't get funded like big biogeophysical models. We get much smaller pots of money and are limited in what we can do in terms of integration. So
right.
I think that's changing, but it is a limiting factor right now. If I put in a proposal for, a multi-million-dollar proposal for an economic impact, it's almost dead in the water.
Yeah. There's partly, I think there's kind of an attribution problem there that if you model an ocean with a finer grid, it's pretty easy to demonstrate your success. Whereas if you model an economy with richer feedback, it's still tougher to get people to believe that the constructs that you're representing are real and that you've actually achieved something.
That's right.
Okay, let's keep going because I want to get to some diagrams of the system. Before we do, just a couple of observations on some existing models. This is a kind of a schematic of the recovery process from an oil spill from just a ecosystem valuation paper that I pulled out, but I think it's representative of a lot of things that I've seen. So the basic concept is the spill causes some immediate harm, and then you recover gradually, and you recover more quickly if you have some kind of restoration and cleanup effort. So I've seen this now in a number of places, but I thought it left out a bunch of things that are important to not only ecosystem services, but also socioeconomic systems in general. So one is the question of what do you do before the spill happens? Another is the idea that effects may be permanent if there's any kind of path dependence or state dependence in the system. You may not get back to the condition you were in previously. And yet another is that there are often a lot of policies that make things worse in the short run in order to get better in the long run. And that's a difficult barrier to overcome with the constituents for your decision, because you're proposing to harm people now for an uncertain benefit later on. And that doesn't, that's not a kind of decision making that democratic systems are very good at anyway. I was just curious if this calls to mind any other kind of generic dynamics of impacts and recovery processes. Are there other pathways to impacts on socioeconomic systems that are important insights for decision makers?
I'd say there's a compounding effect if we experience multiple disasters before we ever get back to our long-term.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it might not be you have one oil spill, God forbid we have two or three in a row, or hurricanes where you might permanently depress your ability to grow a sector, because it keeps getting hit over and over, even if you improve sustainability and resilience.
Oh, good point. And it might not just be multiple spills, it might be a spill and a hurricane,
right,
and a flood.
Right. And I would say it matters. We've got the cyclical or seasonal variations in the ecosystem services there, but there's also cyclical economic activity. So it might depend on where you were in, you know, are you in good times or bad times when the disaster happens? Will be critical for what that welfare loss is.
Right. Are you at full employment and or in a downturn, and do people have alternatives where they can move inland, and what state are their reserves in, and so on. Actually, that's probably a set of additional things in the internal state of the system here. Reserves and maybe insurance and other kinds of things as well are.
Before you leave that. Yeah, and I was going to say insurance earlier, but it looked like you were talking more broadly, but I agree. And the general market situation for any particular sector can mean the difference between recovery or a tipping point or threshold in which they don't come back from a physical shock. So take, for example, recreational fisheries, recreational for hire versus commercial shrimping. The first one has virtually no insurance across the average because they're suppressed by globalization pressures. The other one's much more resilient. So when we talk about compounding effects, they're not just biophysical.
Yeah. So if a market has a protected local niche or something, then they're more robust to shocks. Yeah. Okay. Great additions. Anything else on this?
Well, this is Mike Jepson again. There was one thing it kind of goes back to your idea about resilience, and it comes from an article I read a few years back after Katrina, and it talked about hurricanes as being gentrifiers, and the fact that once the disaster happens, how a community comes back is sometimes dependent upon what happens, and sometimes that gentrification occurs, and so you may have a much different community than you did previously, but the community still exists. So is that resilient? I struggle with this when I look at communities that were commercial fishing communities that have transitioned to a more tourism-based community. It's still the community is still there, but it's a much different type of community. So that sort of resilience is, what is that? What is resilience in that sense?
Yeah. So sort of an output related to that is community type, which encompasses.
Right. Yeah. And I think this came up during Katrina with a lot of the neighborhoods in New Orleans, how they were becoming more gentrified after that hurricane.
Right. And you can imagine reasons for that, for example, the things that recover are the things that have access to capital, which are automatically somewhat different than those that don't. Good point. Let's see. I'll just flip through these quickly because I want to get on to a picture of the system so far and see what we can add. This is a flow chart for assessment from a cost-benefit study on drilling regulations from, I should have put the citation on here, but it's from Resources for the Future. So this is just an example of a cost-benefit analysis that's essentially a tree of costs and benefits. I think this is kind of an ad hoc structure, but there's lots of this kind of workaround. You can reduce it to a more formal table that's essentially an enumeration of all of the impacts that you're interested in, and then all of the points of impact. So where they appear in accounts, either on market or off market. And probably the off market columns over here at the right are pretty crucial because they tend to be big and unmeasured and have a tendency to get left out of decision making. So presumably if we're trying to make things better, getting those things more tightly coupled is crucial. I don't know if this triggers any thoughts of other things that are out there. It's interesting, I haven't seen a comprehensive kind of ex post cost-benefit analysis on Deepwater Horizon. There are accounting-based assessments of how much it cost BP, but not an overall sort of table like this. Then there are also, there seems to be a class of models that are essentially regression models that look at expected cleanup costs based on the size of a spill and other attributes like characteristics of the oil and where it is. And these abstract away a lot of the physics, so I think they're in a sense less sophisticated than doing this with the connectivity modeling system and knowing where the oil's actually going to go. But these are a way of integrating knowledge across several different spills. Another example of this kind of approach is a model called EPA BOSCM, which is Basic Oil Spill Cost Estimation Model. This one's sort of interesting because it includes a whole bunch of line items for socioeconomic costs, but basically I think it's going in as a multiplier in a regression equation. So there's sort of a social vulnerability factor which can be low or high, not an explicit model of how an economy or a coastal society actually works. And then another key aspect of this is uncertainty. And I haven't seen much stochastic modeling. This is one example, which is a decision analysis model looking at a well release. So if you start up at the top left corner here, you have a spill, and in the blue box a response, and then you end up down at in the bottom tier with onshore and offshore responses, and you can add up the utility from the various impacts, and that's to some extent contingent on your level of response effort, whether you do mechanical recovery of oil, for example, or whether you use dispersants. So this model, I think, spans a lot of the space of interest, but it's probably not a very good dynamic model for sure, because it's kind of exclusively stochastic and doesn't say much about internal state of the system and evolution over time. So it's, by virtue of simplification of the representation to accommodate the uncertainty, it's lost perhaps some of the essence of the problem, like the ecosystem dynamics. So what we want is kind of all of the above. We want good ecosystem dynamics and good economic dynamics and uncertainty propagated through that. So actually one area where that's at least possible, I don't know if it's been done yet, and maybe Agal can comment on that again, is again in the CMS, you can generate, as I understand it, stochastic scenarios for the incidence of the spill, and you could then propagate that into the fisheries or use the outputs for other purposes to get uncertain impacts on different types of communities or industries.
Yeah, that's true.
Have you guys done that yet, or is it still kind of in the potential stage?
So we did a separate paths. So each project consists of a certain path, but we haven't officially connected them into one framework.
Okay. And then the last thing that somebody mentioned on the webinar on Monday is the ecosystem services assessment at the National Research Council. That's quite recent. I haven't really absorbed that. I don't know if my impression was this is a report, not a model. It may imply a model or enumerate the impacts that need to be in a model, but it isn't itself an interactive tool, essentially. So it's more like the IPCC climate assessments in that respect. Any thoughts that these things trigger? Okay, let's talk about the connections, and I'll just walk you through kind of the picture that we're building so far. And let me do this in Vensim so we can edit it. So this is still a subset of things that we've talked about so far, but a lot of things that have come up in the last couple of webinars are now populated here. So let me just talk about a couple of pathways through the spaghetti because it's sort of overwhelming on the top. So one is kind of a direct pathway, and I think this is close to what's been done already with the CMS, which is the red arrows here. So you have an oil spill, you run it through the physics of transport degradation, you use that to discover where the oil is going to end up. Then from that, you know what the toxic risk to fisheries is. That gives you perceived safety via some decision-making process that leads to closures of fishing areas. The closures diminish your seafood harvest, and that affects income and employment, or at least it affects revenue, and then from that you can quickly get to income and employment, and by plugging that into a REMI or an IM plan, you could capture the spillovers on the non-fishing economy. And actually, I think what the CMS has done is a little more sophisticated from that, because it also captures through Atlantis the knock-on effects that are happening in the ecosystem dynamics. And so that would be the green loops here. So you're capturing total ecosystem. And then another thing, so you've got the red pathway, which is kind of the direct path to diminished fishing revenue. The green pathways through the biomass imply another set of pathways, which is that if the long-term fish biomass is depressed due to mortality or reproduction problems, then that's another mechanism which is going to lower your harvest, either through direct scarcity or through closures based on stock assessments. And then you have the social feedback loops start to kick in. So one set is the pink things here. So one is that as the income and employment falls in that industry, it has less capital to reinvest in new technology or new vessels or new whatever it is they need. And that affects future harvests. And if there are economies of scale and other kinds of increasing returns in that process, that could lead to extinction of the industry, as we were talking about a few minutes ago. And then there may also be long-run effects on the consumer side. If perceived safety takes a hit, then consumers may shift their habits to other products, and that affects demand for seafood and seafood prices. And those changes may be permanent if they involve sort of establishment of new tastes and cooking habits and dietary habits, things like that. Interrupt me at any time if this triggers thoughts. otherwise I'll just keep talking through these.
I have just one thought.
Yeah.
So basically, you're mainly talking about mechanistic modeling, which model sort of processes. I think probably any pathway or even the entire framework can be also tested looking at the actual data. For example, following the Deepwater Horizon.
Mm-hmm.
So each of the links can be actually tested whether this really affects, the component as the mechanistic model predicts. So I think that can be interesting.
Oh, right. So there's kind of an outer loop to all of this process. So there's sort of the inner loops are the feedbacks that we've postulated to exist here and how they interact to produce an outcome. And then the outer loop is testing that structure against reality to see if the things that actually happened in the data also happen in the model, and vice versa.
And it's not only testing, because if you establish a statistical relationship, then you can also predict, right? Regression type prediction. So,
right. And of course, you might not get all of the model aspects a priori. You might also learn that a relationship exists through data mining that you hadn't previously suspected, and then try to figure out causally how that works and incorporate that in the model.
Yeah.
Yeah, good points. Let's see. So these are a set of things that are sort of impacts on the socioeconomic system that are mediated by ecosystem dynamics. Then they start to have spillover effects in the human health part of the system, which are these purple links here. So one is that income and employment affects community health, whether the community has the resources to do things. It also affects whether people can afford health care. It affects their mental health status. And all of that affects health, which affects productivity, which in turn affects the economy's sort of ability to function, and therefore closes the loop on income and employment. That's one set. Another set of impacts on health status are from toxic exposure. So one pathway for that is through seafood consumption. Another possibility is cleanup activity. And to the extent to which resources for that come from other things, there probably ought to be some cleanup and restoration effort links to income and employment, because that may employ people who are out of work from, say, seafood closures. And then there's a set of exposure from other kinds of activities, recreation, and just ambient exposure from air quality and things like that, which are contingent on risk behaviors that may depend on recreation or other aspects of the non-fishing economy. So other aspects of the community influence those activities as well. So that's another set of pathways that close the loop from the economy to toxic exposure to health status, which feeds back to the economy. And of course, granularity becomes important here, because exposure may be quite different for people in different industries. So really you need to break out this diagram according to people who are working in fishing versus tourism versus other aspects of the economy, because they may be differentially impacted by these things, but hard to capture that here in a compact way. Another set of pathways through the system are things like tourism. So tourism here is another contributor to income and employment. It's influenced by consumer confidence, which has something to do with perception of safety and toxicity, but also just the access to recreation from beach closures and simply, well, whether beaches are closed or not, whether they're oiled or they're pleasant to be on. And that may not only contribute to income and employment, but it also contributes to recreation opportunities for the local population. And tourism is one of the behaviors that leads to exposure as well. Although again, for a different class of people, because the tourists may not be the same as the residents of the coastal community. Then finally, the things that are left over in blue over here on the right relate to some of the long-term dynamics around coastal development. So you have, you have several sets of feedback loops here, really. So one is that income and employment opportunities affect the population and migration pressures. And then population pressure influences coastal development. Coastal development has impacts directly on ecosystem services. That's the link here. Availability of those ecosystem services influences the attractiveness of the area for further migration. So if storm risk is higher or water quality is lower, then fewer people are going to migrate in. But then there are also effects of that that are mediated by the biomass, essentially. So do you have healthy populations of grasses for dune stabilization or healthy marsh ecosystem and things like that? All of those things are providing ecosystem services that influence both the attractiveness for population migration, and actually also, of course, they're an intrinsic outcome for welfare to the extent that these things have existence value to people, or that they provide recreational opportunities for, say, bird watching and things like that. So that's the picture that we've compiled so far. I'm curious what we can add to this that we don't have yet.
This is Rex. I want to echo a couple things that were shared.
Sure.
I agree the point that was made earlier about the ability to look back with 10 years and maybe do some validation of these things. But one of the things that always, I work a lot in marine extension in addition to doing economic modeling too, but you started off with some notes from Monday morning. I was in a plenary, so I missed that, but I think it might have been David Yoskowicz who talked about decision-making relevant scales.
Yeah.
And when I see these spaghetti models, I'm always really fascinated. I've done some of them myself, but the bigger they get, the more nodes they are, the more feedback loops they are, the more that validation challenge increases and becomes more important. Then you have this attribution issue. Just because there's a statistical relationship between one of these nodes or two of these nodes and a feedback loop doesn't mean you fully accounted for interactions and other things. And so I think if there's something that I would add, it would just be what the limitations are for.
Yeah.
And one of the limitations I don't see on here, maybe you've got another slide on that, is there has to be some point made about the availability of information, especially when it comes to humans and making decisions, whether it's consumers deciding on which seafood to eat, which we learned after the BP Horizon event, that I shouldn't say this, but luckily there wasn't enough information for them to be as discriminatory as they wanted to be when it came to avoiding Gulf seafood because of labeling.
Oh, meaning there's no point of origin labeling. So
well, there's country of origin, but at the time there was very little traceability, and some of that's changing. Another issue is just the Gulf of Mexico Ocean Observing System, or ocean observing systems in general, have only been around for about 20, 30 years. They're advancing. The interfaces are expanding and advancing for people to access that information, but it's still lagged, and it's something that will make recreation decisions and where people spend their time and their money, more efficient, and make these feedback loops better in the future. But there's not some sort of standard information availability across these lines at all, obviously.
Right. So
limitations, I guess, and I know we always get to that at the end, but I think that's really important to embrace that. And initially, with the limitations I see, something like this is much better as a descriptive tool, at least if it's going to be very broad, than a predictive tool or a prescriptive tool. But
right. So I guess there's several possible ways to proceed with something like this. So, what we have here is essentially a descriptive tool, and you can't look at this and determine visually or by any other method what feedback loops here are going to dominate the outcome, which is probably a good thing. So it's more a way of having the ability to scan the space and think through, okay, if I'm going to do something that's going to improve or harm fish biomass, what are the repercussions of doing that? Well, it's going to affect ecosystem services and seafood harvest and so on. And you can follow those ripple effects through the system visually, and at least know what questions to ask. Whether you could build a model that captured all these things today is a much harder question, especially because things like community health is not it's not really a state of the system. You'd have to unpack that to some component concepts that maybe even then you couldn't measure them, but at least you could quantify them in an intelligent way.
One other just general observation I'll quickly make, and I heard someone else wants to say something, so I'll be quick. Invariably, we postulate in these models negative outcomes, and that is one of the reasons we do them, to try and get a track on what could happen and mitigate that. But there may be some bias in that, because you can go back and look at the actual data and find that there are winners in these catastrophes and disasters as well. And yet we as scientists don't tend to do that. We don't think about who wins in a situation. I'm not saying we should call for the, a wholesale change on how we think about this, but to not have that as sort of a possible loop or feedback or
So there's another behavior mode, at least from the perspective of some actors in this system. There may be a mode that in which people wind up better off than they were
right
than they were
and
before.
And I'm not calling for that as a in a value positive way. It's just something we've observed. A good example is the mold abatement sector really did well after Katrina.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Well,
So
and then
Krista, I've got to drop off, but I just wanted to echo what Rex said. And, I also work in extension, and a lot of my extension program is talking with policymakers and decision makers. And the more complicated we make the model, the less trusted it is on their part sometimes. So there's a very big difference in what we're incentivized to do as academics and how what we're doing as academics can inform decision making.
Got it. Yeah.
But
So
thank you.
Thank you. Somebody else?
So Rex, this is Missy. So I appreciate you bringing in there the idea of information availability, because obviously as an extension person, it's my job to get information out. But I was thinking if there was some way to have some kind of educational component in here, because access to information, but access to education and ability to, change employment based on, opportunities and access to training and education is obviously something we see a lot about in these coastal communities. But the other thing I was wondering about, I'm not a modeler. I don't see, we talked a lot about when we did the ecosystem services calls about maybe age structure and populations of fish biomass, et cetera.
Yeah.
But we don't really talk about age structure in the human communities. And, where you've got differential vulnerabilities, based on your age in the population. But, disasters also impact family planning, whether or not they are choosing to have, additional children, which, it's just something we start to see. So I'm just wondering if there is some kind of, again, it is complicated because it is a spaghetti diagram and it's its job to be complicated, but that there is not just productivity being a feedback to income and employment and population migration, but mental health impacts and healthcare availability and health status and all that stuff play into family planning.
Yep.
And that can feed then back on population and migration, et cetera.
Good point. And yeah, and so that's that's also kind of a health status related item. I think we're sort of approaching the point with this diagram probably where we'd have to start breaking it up into some separate ones just to have more real estate and have a way to focus on some particular problems like that. But I think that kind of granularity of the population to look at the rich versus the poor, or different people employed in different sectors, or age structure and other kinds of things would be important here. And probably just as this diagram is reaching its limits of comprehensibility, the strategy for modeling, at least up front, might be to essentially use something like this as a roadmap into more topical models that focus on particular aspects of the system, so that you don't get too far off on the kind of the complexity versus trust spectrum. Good thoughts. Other thoughts on this? I think there are a bunch of other states that we added to the list here that are probably not captured. So I added this link here, education that creates knowledge, and that presumably affects things like consumer confidence and decision making. Another key aspect might be that it relates to risky behavior, or hopefully avoidance of risky behavior. And it actually might have some direct welfare outcomes too, to the extent that knowing how systems work is intrinsically interesting to people, and it might reduce their level of fear about problems and increase their sense of agency or control over their own fate. So actually, that's another thing that's missing here is, welfare is kind of an explicit outcome, which is a function of people and money and services and knowledge and health and maybe recreation, to the extent that that's not on the books either. Let's see. So my point about education and knowledge here is that that's one aspect of this outcomes box that we created. But there might be other things as well. So it's not just having the education and the knowledge to make good decisions, but it's also having institutions in place that are capable of, doing a good job of trading off all of the competing values in the system, and maybe culture influences these things as well. So culture is going to be influencing it's partly a function of knowledge. It's also influencing behavior and activities and preferences for foods and things like that. So there are probably a couple of additional layers that we could add here.
Well, I think sometimes, Tom, we call it social capital, right?
Yeah, so which is kind of closely related, I think, to what we mean by community health here. A healthy community then being something that has a lot of social capital. There were, going back to the Sea Grants compilation of stakeholder questions, there were a lot of questions about how to build community resilience. And a lot of the answers typically are about things like, building up networks in various ways so that people have greater access to resources either within their community or from other inland parts of the economy. Certainly the regional economic models, the input-output models don't really capture any of that. But we don't have good models for those in other ways. Yeah, go ahead.
So sorry, we just wrapped up a series of nationwide workshops talking about community preparedness and resilience to oil spills. And something that's come up in a number of the different workshops where we're actually soliciting input from community members on what they think they need in order to be more prepared or resilient to a future oil spill. Some community members have pointed out that resilience implies return to the previous state, as you had talked about in your earlier ecosystem services graph. Mm-hmm. The wobble, and you have a point of depression and then restoration that brings you back.
Oh, yeah.
Again. But a number of community members pointed out that regardless of there being some normal cyclical fluctuation in the model, they were already operating at a depressed state, and they don't want to be resilient to the sense returning to their original depressed state.
Yeah.
So we're talking about ways of how do we change the phrasing around the idea of this resilience and socioeconomic resilience and getting communities to be resilient is somehow getting them to be maybe culturally resilient. So some of the things that they cared most about, or that their community sense of well-being, I'm glad you put that little well-being box down there, returns to how they had hoped it would be, but maybe at an elevated level, that we want people to somehow see improvement in their state, because a lot of the communities that are most impacted and vulnerable were already living at a fairly, depressed level. And so if they're already in disaster mode prior to a disaster, then bouncing back to that same, stressed state is not helpful.
And then that's part of the reason they don't have the resources to use to recover. So starting from a depressed state may be part of the reason you don't get back even to your former depressed state. But really, you'd like to have a win-win where you find ways to get out of poverty traps and other sorts of things.
That's a really great point, and it's the bounce forward idea, not the bouncing back, right? But the bouncing forward. That's really
exactly. And I thank you for using that phrase. I really do like it when I hear that bounce forward rather than bounce back.
I'm just gonna put that on here too. Interesting case of language shaping thinking.
Words matter, as we say.
Yeah. Other things on this picture?
Hi, Tom. This is Helena.
Hi.
Hi. I wasn't able to listen to the first 45 minutes. I was in a place that didn't have good internet, so it may have already been discussed. And it's not my area of expertise. But in looking at all of these different factors, I can understand having people, decision makers, make a decision on economics, that this is a better economic. But how do you compare economic indices with community health? I was just thinking, how can, given all the different values here, in different units, has there been a discussion about how to compare? And I thought the Socio-Economics group would be most sensitive to that, because dealing with the whole broad area of socioeconomics.
We certainly haven't talked about that yet, really. So, for example, how would you value an outcome that made a community more resilient in some sense against one that increased GDP in the fisheries and forest sector by $32.5 million?
This is Rex. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So one way we've done that in the past, I mentioned multi-criteria analysis, is the development of indicators of various weights within indices along various axes, disciplinary axes, economic, environmental, social. The challenge when you do that, when you look at multiple outcomes or disparate goals, perhaps for trade-offs with that framework, is that the weighting of those indicators and the weighting of those indices between the various disciplines is the challenge. Do you do it very democratically at a granular scale with the general population, or do you use expert panels? And then it's not a static thing, it's an evolving thing, and it depicts the values of a certain group in a certain point of time and space. But that is one way we've done this in the past, to examine trade-offs for things that might improve the environment, but not necessarily do the same for the economy, or vice versa.
Right. So then, so you can do it with explicit weights, and an economist would probably say that then you're essentially creating implicit prices for these things. So you might as well just have one utility metric anyway. But then there are other ways to do this as well, like letting people pick their own weights. And of course, to some extent, people don't know a priori what their weights are. So they would often like to see lots of different outcomes in order to start saying, aha, I like future A better than future B.
Right.
And then only later do you discover exactly why it was that you prefer one outcome to another.
Right, and just as an addition, and maybe you are getting at this, but the weighting isn't just on monetary lines. Clearly within an economic index, you would see a lot of that, but not exclusively. But within the geophysical, biophysical, social metrics or indices, the weighting would be between, you know, things as variable as water quality to quality of life. So,
right, yeah. So it might be a combination of health status and biomass and toxicity of species and, you know, clean water, things like that.
But I think the challenge with that approach, and it's similar to this one, is there's no shortage of novel creative ways to build these indices, but it's making them meaningful, i.e. the weighting. How does that get played out? And I'm convinced after looking this over many years is that whether it's multi-criteria or a spaghetti model or a state master plan, that has to be a combination of expert panel and more democratic, granular sort of decision input. If it's not, it suffers from problems on either end. And I don't know where the ideal integration is for how to do that. But that's where things usually run off the track. They become either too democratic or way too centralized. And it's pretty important, some of the decisions that are made on these models. So that is really the challenge.
Right. Yeah, I've seen things kind of go off the rails in both directions as well. That kind of brings us to another topic that I'd like to talk about for a couple minutes here, which is actually, where does this intersect with particular decision makers? If this is readable, I'm going to make it, I'm going to shrink it just to give ourselves a little bit more space. And add a couple of rows because we've added a number of concepts. So things we've talked about are sort of institutions and subsets of, you know, education and things like that. I think we added a few other concepts as well. Where is socioeconomic systems research intersecting decision makers now? I would guess, you know, FEMA, for example, is pretty interested in resilience and preparedness and things like that.
Sure, FEMA, but also SAS, of course, and there's a number of agencies. NOAA involved, obviously. I mean, there's 27 federal agencies that participate in these resilience task force once a disaster strikes.
Ah, okay. So there's actually
there's a
kind
list.
of a formal list.
And there's also frameworks for how they engage at state and local levels. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
I'm much more familiar with the hurricane response and recovery than with oil.
Mm-hmm.
There also are frameworks for oil spill as well.
And does that extend all the way to the local engagement as well?
Yes.
And
but it's different in how the federal government organizes is the same approach, but then of course it differs according to the state as it trickles down from state to local.
Oh, just because of the different sort of org chart of the
different
state.
Institutions and different ways that the states operate at the local level. Yeah.
Right.
Different separations of authorities, et cetera.
So what you're kind of talking about down there, so is that, you know, FEMA is what's utilized for storm response, but that operates under the Stafford Act from '88, and that is what gives the federal government and then state governments and local governments to declare states of emergency that then releases the funds available to go in and help these communities after this. But oil spills are actually governed under OPA 90, which came out, the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which came out basically after several oil spills in the 80s, but really Exxon Valdez was the big tipping point. And that puts the U.S. Coast Guard as the authority under the response, but it makes it the responsible party, the spiller of the oil, who at least initially is fiscally responsible. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes along with that. But FEMA, unless the spill is a result of a storm or some other kind of disaster that, like a landslide or something like that, then you might have overlapping authority between those federal entities. But otherwise, FEMA doesn't frequently come into play with issues of oil spill unless there's some other, additional causal reason that you'd have those overlapping authorities.
Got it. And in the, for example, in the Sea Grant network, a lot of the interested parties are local. The fishing industry and things like that. Are they actually, well, so maybe that's a question. Are they interacting through outreach to local fishermen, or are they interacting through industry associations and things like that that are organized at some higher level?
Can you
read the Sea Grant interaction?
Yeah, I was just curious how you kind of, how you reach local organizations and individuals and kind of local NGOs with information and pathways to decision making.
Missy, I interrupted you, Missy. I know you can answer this question, so I'll let you go first, but I misunderstood the question. I was asking for a clarification. Thank you.
Okay.
So our oil spill network has a way, ways that we reach into communities now, and we do have different stakeholder groups and maybe leaders of different organizations that we might reach out to that then can disseminate into communities. But we also do boots on the ground stuff and work with other extension agents within the Sea Grant network to get out into those communities. And so Rex has been with Sea Grant much longer than I have, so he can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, we, regardless of the issue, we have a multi-pronged approach. We work through trade associations. We do demonstration projects, if it's tech transfer or regulatory compliance or how to access the policy process at the individual level as well. All kinds of different modes for relaying that information, from one-on-one consulting to workshops to fact sheets to websites to summits that we do every 2 years with the commercial fishing sector. So it's a radio, TV, video. So I guess the question would be more easily answered if it was, is this just in regards to, say, a particular type of event, in this case, an oil spill? And that's why I said Missy is much more experienced in that aspect, even though she's newer in the organization.
I guess I'm sort of curious about everything, but to be productive here, I guess the question is, to what extent are models or the outcomes of models getting out and informing these processes, or where are there big opportunities for doing that?
So I think one of the challenge when you get outreach based on modeling is managing expectations,
mm-hmm.
and owning the limitations up front. But in the case of, let's say, a state master plan that's budgeted at $50 billion, that's become a politically, polarized issue in Louisiana, there may be some tendency to not want to emphasize those limitations, or to open the playbook too much for something that may be vulnerable already. One of the problems we've had is
And is that, just out of curiosity, is that a state economic master plan? That's
it's a geophysical realignment of the coast through river diversions, dredging, vegetative restoration, and let's just take diversions for example, because you mentioned that as, I think, maybe obliquely early on in the call, as something that could actually cause long-term restoration, but maybe near-term negative economic consequences. The decision makers that are affected by that restoration plan, or in this case a diversion, need as much information as they can to make the best decisions that they can, but they don't always get the range of potential outputs from the model because those ranges are highly variable, developing in real time. And so what happens is it ends up being, trust us, we're from the government, we have a really complicated plan. You can't understand it, but if you could, you'd love it. and it's going to be really good for your grandchildren. And so I don't know if there's an easy solution for this, but when it comes to outreach on model-based policy, it takes time, and it takes trust, and it takes owning the limitations and providing as much information about the range of potential outputs given uncertainty in the model, so that people appreciate that you're being as transparent as you can. And that is another challenge that I find when it comes to model-based interaction when we deal with fishermen, for example. So as a net result, they kind of just tend to say, well, we don't believe any of it.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I don't know if anybody else on the phone has had that experience, but that's kind of a rough answer to your question. So.
And I would imagine so then you have additional problems because the model comes along and is handed to people as a fait accompli, and there's sort of an intrinsic distrust, probably rightfully so, of something complicated that's handed to you to convince you of something.
Well, this is Mike Jepson, and everything that Rex had said is having been involved in that process. I think part of the problem was that they really lagged in bringing the human dimensions into that whole modeling exercise or the whole process, and I partly because some of the reasons that Rex had pointed out, they just didn't think it was that important, but it became very important, certainly when they got backlash. And I think integrating that in the beginning could be very helpful and maybe avoid some of those pitfalls. Not always, but I think that was part of that problem, is that they really didn't take it seriously.
So is there a example of that? Is it leaving out value of certain ecosystem services that turn out to be important to a bunch of people?
Someone was about to say something, I think.
Oh, well, I wasn't going to provide an example. Sorry.
Jump in.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add on top of that is, and this is why there's a burgeoning field of knowledge co-production, because again, trust becomes really important, and building the models with the folks who are supposed to use them becomes very important. And so if you don't do that, you can even lose really critical local ecological knowledge. So there's, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, and local ecological knowledge. And these things can be quite important for understanding local effects and environmental change and feedbacks. And when they're captured and the decision makers or the stakeholders can see how and why that information was used or not used, right? Then they're more apt to trust and use the models and their results.
Right. And I'm just noticing that we're over time. This is a terrific conversation, and I'm happy to stick around and keep talking if anybody else has the energy. But I want to ask just one last question before thanking you all and signing off, which is processes. So I think we've identified lots of processes to go in the model and lots of limitations and ways for them to intersect with decision making. Is there anything that should be created here in terms of model infrastructure, you know, data repositories and ways of connecting things, or organizational infrastructure and processes, you know, new conferences, new forums for people to talk to one another and co-create models that are the next step towards integration? Is there anything that should be happening on that front to make all of this ambitious scope tractable?
I have a suggestion. This is Rex. In the projects that I've been involved with that are really complicated, multidisciplinary integration problems, it helps to have an advisory, a regularly scheduled sort of advisory committee to kind of not just provide things you haven't thought of, but also bring some reality to what you're doing, so that you don't work in a bubble for a year and then come up with something that you understand but no one else does. So,
yeah.
And maybe that's what we are on this call. I don't know, but I've been so busy with the conference this last several months. Maybe I didn't pay attention. I've already joined an advisory committee. I don't know. So.
You're hired.
Okay.
Yeah, Rex, that's a great point. And I would just emphasize, we've talked about Sea Grant, but extension on the whole as a key process for iterative engagement with the folks on the ground that are supposed to use these results is really not, folks pay homage to it often, but perhaps the resources I don't see being expended as much as they could be, or in my opinion should be.
Thanks.
Right, yeah, that's key. So we want it to be not a pipeline where extension is the end of the pipe that delivers knowledge to people, but for it to be a two-way flow.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're 5 minutes over, so let's call it a wrap. We will have the opportunity in a couple of weeks to revisit all this. So there's going to be one more session on physics, and then we'll have a series of what we're calling B sessions, which are essentially iterative refinement of what we've learned from all the A sessions. So we'll come back to you with essentially more of these and some more integration of the various great thoughts that have come out in these conversations, and we'll have another chance to talk about this and think about strategies for integrating models and integrating the models and modelers with the decision makers. So thanks, everybody. Great conversation, and I look forward to more.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Tom. Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.